All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're exploring a period in history that honestly played out like a high stakes, incredibly ruthless global game of conquest. We're talking about the years between 1870 and 1914, when a few industrialized superpowers essentially raced to claim almost the entire board. And by the board, I mean the rest of the planet. We call this era the Age of Imperialism. It's a time that completely reshaped global trade, destroyed ancient societies, and literally drew lines on the map that we are still dealing with today. So let's really think about this. Imagine you're playing a massive, real-world strategy game. You start out with just your home territory, but through rapid industrialization and sheer military force, you and a handful of other players manage to take over almost the entire globe in just a few decades. Seriously, how does that even happen? How did a select few nations manage to assert their dominance over millions and millions of people across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific? Well, that is exactly the question we're going to answer right now. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll define what imperialism actually is. Then we'll look at the motives for expansion, explore the Great Global Partition, break down the different forms of colonial control, and finally, look at the devastating consequences of all this domination. Starting off with Section 1, what exactly is imperialism? Well, it's definitely not just about exploring new, uncharted places. Imperialism is the absolute domination of one country, which we call the metropolis, over territories outside its borders, which then become its colonies. The metropolis takes over completely. We're talking total political, economic, and military control. It is absolutely not a partnership. It's a deeply unequal system designed so the metropolis can extract resources and exploit the local population entirely for its own benefit. Moving right along to Section 2, the motives for expansion. So, why did they do it? Historians generally agree there were 5 main motivations driving this incredibly aggressive expansion. You can kind of think of these as the reasons these empires wanted to level up. They were driven by economic needs, political competition with each other, ideological beliefs, religious missions, and scientific curiosity. Ultimately, they wanted more wealth, more prestige, and much more influence on the global stage. Let's break down the biggest ones. The absolute biggest driver was the economy. The Industrial Revolution had totally transformed Western Europe, and factories were just booming. Now, think about the smartphone in your pocket right now. It needs a battery, right? And that battery requires rare earth metals to function. Well, 19th century industrialized empires were exactly the same way. To keep their massive factories running, they desperately needed huge amounts of raw materials like rubber, cotton, and metals. Colonies basically provided a cheat code for cheap, extracted resources. Plus, they served as huge new markets of people who were literally forced to buy their manufactured goods. But, they didn't exactly tell the world, hey, we are doing this to steal your rubber and make a ton of money. Nationalistic sentiment was deeply, deeply intertwined with racist ideologies. Many Europeans falsely justified their violent conquests through a concept famously called the white man's burden. They paternalistically claimed it was their noble duty to govern and civilize other peoples. It was, simply put, a deeply racist justification used to mask the dark reality of colonial rule. Let's dive into Section 3, the Great Global Partition. By the early 20th century, an ultimate imperial leaderboard had emerged. Britain was the undisputed heavyweight champion, claiming the largest empire in human history, which included India, famously called the Jewel of the Crown. France took massive chunks of Africa and Indochina. Germany arrived a bit late to the party, but still grabbed large territories in East and West Africa. Meanwhile, the United States became an overseas power by taking the Philippines after a war with Spain. And Japan, following their super rapid modernization, Japan absolutely stunned the world by defeating Russia and claiming Korea and Taiwan, proving for sure that you didn't have to be European to play this imperial game. Now, this aggressive expansion was probably most obvious in Africa. We literally call it the Scramble for Africa. Around 1870, the scramble kicks off. By 1914, the entire board is essentially claimed. In just a few short decades, a whole massive continent was carved up. And the big turning point of this rapid division was a meeting right in the middle, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The numbers here are just truly staggering. 14 European countries sat around a table in Berlin to draw lines on a map and establish rules for occupying African territory. Do you know how many African representatives were invited to this conference about the future of their own continent? 0. Not a single one. It just highlights the sheer audacity of these imperial powers, dividing up millions of people without once consulting them. No way around it. It's shocking. And while those European diplomats sat in their comfortable, civilized meeting rooms, the reality on the ground was a nightmare. Take Belgium's King Leopold II. He didn't even claim the Congo for his country. He claimed it as his own personal property. His regime forced the local population into extracting rubber under a system of unimaginable violence and terror. Millions of people died. It's a really stark reminder that behind all that civilizing ideology was a brutal, incredibly bloody reality. Moving on to Section 4, Forms of Colonial Control. So empires essentially had different settings for how tightly they wanted to control an area. The most direct was a colony. Here, the metropolis exercised full, total sovereignty. They brought in their own laws, built their own schools, and ruled directly. Think of Britain's setup in India. On the other hand, you had the protectorate. In a protectorate, the colonizers controlled the money and foreign policy, but they allowed local authorities to manage day-to-day internal affairs. It gave this illusion of local autonomy, but make no mistake, the metropolis was still firmly holding the leash. And then there was the concession. I honestly like to think of this one as an imperial cheat code. A concession was a special zone inside an otherwise independent country where foreign powers got to make the rules. China is the best example of this. European powers in Japan couldn't conquer all of China, so instead they forced China to hand over specific areas, like parts of Shanghai, where foreign businesses operated totally freely, and local Chinese laws didn't even apply to them. Crazy, right? And finally, Section 5, the consequences of domination. As you can imagine, the consequences were severe and long-lasting. The primary goal was always profit, and that meant deep economic exploitation. Local populations were stripped of their lands and forced into low-paid or entirely unpaid labor. Because land was used for export crops instead of local food, terrible famines broke out. Traditional systems of government and society were completely dismantled. And through forced cultural assimilation, colonizers actively suppressed indigenous languages and religions, pushing their own Western cultures onto the people they conquered. But here is where history takes a super fascinating turn. We can call this the ironic cycle of imperialism. By imposing their systems, the empires accidentally planted the seeds of their very own destruction. Step 1, they enforced cultural assimilation and Western education on local elites. Step 2, those local students learned all about Western ideas of liberty, equality, and self-determination. Step 3, they looked around, realized they were being entirely oppressed, and this sparked fierce anti-colonial nationalism. And step 4, this directly led to the massive independence movements that swept the 20th century. So this leaves us with a critical question to think about. How do today's borders reflect this 19th century game of conquest? Really think about it. The languages spoken across Africa and South America, the straight-line borders drawn in the Middle East and Africa that still trigger conflicts today, the massive global wealth inequalities. Literally none of this is a coincidence. The age of imperialism isn't just some dusty history chapter. The lines those empires drew back then are still shaping the exact world you and I live in right now. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.